Okie dokie. Hades' Daughter, Chapter 7. The response took just over one day, the two soldiers finally returning in the hour after the sun had fully risen to where Brutus' three warships lay at anchor. Fully risen to where both were still dressed in the dusty garbs of laborers, but looked well rested and fed. Patently they had met with good hospitality. Well, said Brutus, who sat with Membricus and two others of his senior officers, Idaeus and Hicetaean, on the aft deck of his lead ship. Below them, in the belly of the open ship, men sat on the rowing benches, cleaning and oiling weapons against the constant deprivations of the sea. We have a return message, my lord. You are to travel this evening to Macedoma itself, where you will meet with the residents of Ascarius, who dwells in the highest house against the northern wall. The highest house? Brutus said, raising his eyebrows. Obviously, this was no slave dwelling, not where it could catch the cooling breezes and offer its occupants a fine view. Aye, my lord. This is a trap, said Idaeus, whose manner was always one of caution when others advised action. Brutus sometimes wondered if his innate caution extended to his eating habits as well, for Idaeus was an unnaturally thin man for his height. But for all that Brutus valued such circumspection in a world where so often men thought that wisdom equated with action. Come in, lay down. What are you doing? Okay, yes. Too obvious, said Hicetaean, who was a man more disposed to think of prohibitive caution as a greater risk than unthinking daring. His face, chest, and flanks, and the scars to attest to his philosophy. Brutus had many years' association with both men, and understood the extent of the arguments that lay before their terse statements. He nodded once, slowly, acknowledging their advice, then looked back to the soldier. Who had returned with the response. Tell me in what manner you received this message. We found our way to a man called Dymas, in the slave quarter, the soldier said. He speaks for all of the Trojans. This man Dymas considered your message, and he then asked us to return in the evening. When we did so, he asked us to relay to you the request to go to the house of Ascarius in the city tomorrow night after dusk, just before the gates close. Idaeus hissed softly at this. What do you know of the Ascaricus? Brutus said to the soldier. Dymas said only that he was allied with the Trojan cause. However, he said further to his request that only you attend Ascaricus, that too many strange faces within the city walls could cause comment. One man will attract no comment, especially should you dress as a lowly laborer or farmer. He has given us words for you to say, so that Ascaricus doorkeeper may know you. And Dymas' manner? How would you describe it? He was not overly impressed at your message, my lord, said the soldier. He merely grunted, then laughed shortly. I still say trap, said Idaeus. Enter the city just before the gates close. You will be trapped in. Dymas is being prudent, observed Hicetaean, folding his arms and staring at Idaeus. I agree, Brutus said. Dymas must be asking himself, who is this man who arrives unaccounted and says, I am here to lead you into Troy? I also would first make certain of my own safety. He paused, dismissed the soldier, then studied each of his advisers' faces in turn. Membricus, tell me your thoughts. Does this response cast a shadow over your soul? Do the gods whisper caution in your heart? No, Brutus. This message causes me no disquiet. Do what you will." Aeneas' mouth folded in a tight line, and Brutus had to suppress a smile. "Then I will go," he said. "It could do our cause no harm that I should study the defenses of both wall and gates from inside the city, and perhaps that was Diomed's part intention." In mid-afternoon, Brutus dressed himself in the garb of a simple farmer, a well-worn tunic of coarse weave belted at the waist with a leather strap, a woolen half-cloak against the evening coolness, and leather sandals on his feet. He removed the gold and bronze rings from his fingers and ears, but left the golden bands of kinship on his limbs, blackening them with a liquid made of oil and ash, so that they appeared as if they were made of worthless, stiffened leather. He rubbed a little dust into an otherwise clean and well-oiled black curls on his head, and some more over his hands and arms. He shaved, but only roughly, as would any farmer who had little time for the niceties of ablutions. His shadowy beard also helped to disguise his Trojan features, and for the first time in his life, Brutus thanked the gods for his Latin mother, whose blood had diluted his Trojan appearance. At his belt he hung a pouch into which he placed some small vials of herbed oils to present as gifts to his host, and over his shoulder he slung a larger rope sack containing wild onions, garlic, and a measure of dried figs, as if he intended to sell them within the city. "Do I look like a hero?" he asked Membricus, ready finally to make the journey to Mesopotamia through the afternoon heat. "No," Membricus replied with a half-smile, to take away any sting that might be construed in his words. "You look like a forest brigand. I hope this Ascaricus has the nerve to admit you to his house." Brutus approached Mesopotamia just before dusk. The 2-hour walk through forest and rocky slopes from his ship's anchorage point had been hot, but not as tiring as Brutus had feared it might be. But perhaps Brutus' own sense of excitement and purpose had rid his body of any tiredness it might have felt. For 15 empty years, ever since his exile from Alba and the Tiber, Brutus had been wandering the central Mediterranean, seeking some sense of home. He'd met up with small bands of exiled Trojans, many of whom had joined his band of warriors, and he and his band had fought as mercenaries in the constant inner-city struggles and feuds that gripped the disintegrating Mediterranean world. But he'd never found a home, never found a place where he felt any sense of belonging, never found a true sense of purpose. Now, since Artemis' visit, all had changed. Now he had purpose, a home to aspire to, a power beyond anything he dared hope for, if the goddess was to be believed. And it was he, not his father, nor his grandfather, nor even his noble but ultimately luckless great-grandfather Aeneas, but he who was given the task of rebuilding Troy. For 15 years Brutus had wandered. 15 years since that terrible, wonderful day when he had taken the kingship back from the dead father's limbs. He'd taken a great risk that day and had been exiled for it. But now that risk had been justified and rewarded. He looked at Mesopotamia as it rose before him. Membricus might mutter about shadows, but all Brutus saw was the opportunity to prove conclusively to Artemis that he was fit for her trust and belief, fit to rule over Troy. Mesopotamia sat on a high hill some 100 paces south of the river Acheron, and some 800 paces north of where the river emptied into the bay. The walled city encompassed the entire hill, although a scattering of hovels, workshops, and tanneries sprawled unprotected beyond the walls. Brutus looked closely at the hovels and saw that the women wandering in and out of doorways and the children who played in the dust were Dorians rather than Trojans, confirming his earlier belief that the Trojan slaves lived inside the city. The Trojan slaves likely lived in the houses of their masters, most probably crowded into windowless, cramped rooms and basements, or in hovels set against the interior of the city's walls where space and light were at a premium. He adjusted the sack over his shoulder as he paused to rest, leaning from one foot to the other so that any observer would think him merely tired, and studied the city as best he could. Most of the houses inside the walls, leading up to the civic buildings and the king's palace at the very top of the hill, were well constructed in pale dressed stone with guttered roofs of red tile. The city walls themselves were solid stone, the height of 5 men, from what Brutus could see, almost as thick. His eyes watchful now, Brutus resumed his walk toward the city gates, marking their construction and defenses as he neared. The gates, still open, were of reinforced thick planks of cypress, barred with bronze and hung so that when closed they would give little purchase to attackers. The outer gates opened into a narrow, dark roadway that breached the 10-pace thick walls. Anyone who managed to penetrate the outer gates would suffer heavily from the missiles of defenders positioned high above. Beyond this, on the inner face of the wall, were another pair of gates, almost as solidly built as the outer pair. Once at the outer gates, Brutus was stopped by a guard, who seemed more than half asleep with boredom. Brutus smiled to himself. If his ships had been noticed and reported, the guard would have been far more alert. The guard spoke to him, asked his business, and Brutus, hanging his head so that his features remained largely hidden in the shadows of the wall, replied in his best rustic Greek, saying that he had some dried figs and wild onions to trade for some town-made pots for his wife. The guard, uncaring of either figs or pots or any other doings of peasants, nodded Brutus through, observing as he passed that at his late hour he'd need to find himself a bed for the night until the gates reopened in the morning. Brutus acknowledged him with a wave as he trudged through the initial defensive alley, then glanced to either side as he passed through the inner gates. As he'd theorized, the narrow spaces between wall and lower blocks of Dorian houses and tenement buildings were packed with poorly built and thinly thatched hovels. And even with that brief glance, Brutus could see several women and children moving in the shadows between wall and tenement buildings. Women and children with the distinct features of Troy, his people, dampening down his excitement. Time enough for that once he'd managed to secure their freedom. Brutus walked farther into the city, moving higher through the streets to where he supposed Ascarica's house stood. The city was clearly wealthy, and this pleased Brutus. The pickings would be good. The streets were paved and guttered in stone, a rare luxury. The city's Dorian citizens, now engaged in their final few tasks for the day before the evening set in, were well garbed in clothes that made use of fine materials. Brutus even saw 2 women wearing robes made of rare wild silks. The houses were indeed well built and maintained, and the glimpses inside the Brutus gained through several open doors showed fine interiors, decorated with vivid paints and tiles, and even, in one instance, gilding. A rich city indeed, Brutus murmured to himself, pausing at a street corner to stare about at what he hoped would be taken for the wide-eyed wonder of a countryman. All well for his purpose. He turned left at the street corner, walking up the center of an emptying street that led toward the northern quarter of the city. As he climbed, the houses became larger and grander. clearly the abodes of wealthy and important citizens. Many of them were gated and walled, mini fortresses within the larger city fortress. Palaces, almost. Brutus' curiosity about Assaracus grew even stronger. Who was this man? Clearly wealthy and influential, and even more clearly Greek, to be so allied with the Trojan slaves. And thus ends chapter 7.